Hello and welcome to the program. As we've been talking about, tomorrow the Prime Minister, State Premiers and Chief Ministers will get together for a leaders' retreat. Ahead of that meeting, proposals have already been floated to raise extra money to pay for services such as schools and hospitals. New South Wales has suggested increasing the GST rate from 10 to 15%. Victoria has ruled that out and instead has come up with the option of increasing the Medicare levy. Other states and territories say they're open for discussion. The Council of Social Service, the Business Council and the Chamber of Commerce just want an outcome that includes broad tax reform.
This is about, a shared community leadership here, where we are saying back to our political leaders, you cannot afford at this point in time to be, if one side says we want to do this, the other side says, well, we're not prepared to look at it at all. That's the low point that we both are really concerned about.
Groups like ours, who often come at things from different perspectives, although I think people would be astounded how much we agree on. We have got to work with governments constructively. We've got to frame up the problem. We've got to put the facts on the table. We've got to be honest with the community. And we've got to stay the course. If this is sort of like a one-hit blip, as opposed to a decade-long program of reform where you manage these transitional issues for people, again, it'll be sort of like, we've done tax reform. Well, actually, we haven't. It's actually quite a long process.
Well, as I mentioned, the Chamber of Commerce is part of the push to encourage governments at the Commonwealth, state and territory level to embrace reform. I spoke to John Osborne from the Chamber about his hopes for tomorrow's leaders' meeting. John Osborne, thanks for coming in today. We've already seen some options put on the table for this leaders' retreat, and one of those is the New South Wales proposal to increase the GST rate to 15%. Now, the other states have been quick to rule that out. What hope do you think there is that there will be any consensus coming from this meeting?
Well, not all states have ruled it out, as far as I understand. Colin Barnett from West Australia, Jay Weatherall from South Australia, they haven't said that they would support this specific proposal, but they've said they'll keep an open mind, and that's what we in the business community are asking for. We need to keep all the options on the table. Fundamental tax reform is very important for Australia's economy, and doing nothing is no option. Otherwise, we risk our living standards going backwards and further increasing unemployment. Now, that's something that will be bad for Australia, and we don't want to see that.
Looking at this particular proposal, do you see some merit there in increasing the GST rate to 15%?
Well, the GST is not a silver bullet for tax reform, but it absolutely has to be part of the mix. What we have said is if the GST goes up, we need to be looking at less efficient taxes, things that can go down. Personal income tax is very high. It's almost, it's one of the highest levels of tax in the world. Our company tax rate is making us very uncompetitive. So if we are putting up taxes like the GST, we should be looking at putting other less efficient taxes down and not just grabbing for extra tax revenue.
Well, looking at that, one of the ideas is for compensation for lower income households that would be affected by any increase in the rate of the GST. How do you think compensation would work?
Well, if we were to say put it to 15%, that's some $30 billion worth of extra revenue. Some of that will need to go back by way of targeted welfare payments for those people who are certainly doing it a little tough. No one doubts the need for doing that, but overall we would like to see those taxes redirected into getting rid of less efficient taxes, and that's what happened back in the 90s, and we've got to keep everything in perspective here. No one would say, well, let's unwind the GST now, so no one should be saying, well, let's rule out a change if we can get the balance right, and we're pretty confident in the business community that's something that we can do if the leaders show real leadership and they come together at this conference and beyond.
Do you see any problems or any risks associated with paying out compensation to cover for an increase in the GST?
No, look, when the GST first came in, there was a compensation package for low to middle income households. That is completely normal. The tax system is separate from the welfare system, but these changes have to be made hand in hand. The important thing that we keep in perspective is the need for reform. If we don't have real reform, if we do nothing, then we look at living standards going backwards, Australia at a competitive disadvantage, a less attractive place to invest and do business. That means fewer jobs, and that's just simply something we can't afford when there are 800,000 unemployed people in this country, including some 300,000 young people.
Well, let's look at one of the ideas that Victoria has put forward, which is an increase in the Medicare levy instead. What do you think of that idea?
Well, a Medicare levy, whatever purpose is, it's just another add-on to the income tax. Australia has very high reliance on income tax compared to other countries in the OECD. By increasing the income tax, it is a more distortionary, that is more damaging tax than a goods and services tax. So now that would be a step in the wrong direction, and we need to be looking at what are those broad-based, low-rate taxes that will do least damage to the economy and ensure that people aren't discouraged from investing and they're not discouraged from working that little bit more, doing those few more hours or going for that pay rise. These are the things which ultimately lead to greater production, and that will lead to greater prosperity for Australia.
Now, you've joined forces with the Business Council and the Council of Social Service to call for national leadership to address these kind of issues. Do you think our leaders are failing when it comes to looking at the big picture?
There's no doubt a reform paralysis in this country. We haven't had very significant economic or tax reform in the last 10 years. We need to open up our economy, we need to make ourselves more productive, more competitive, and the best way to do that is to come together, the two major parties in particular. These are the two parties of government. It is the responsibility of them and the entire Parliament to get these reforms secured for the betterment of our whole economy, for all of our people. And yes, we are confident that in time it can come together. Now, it is a negotiation process, but we need to be keeping everything on the table and working constructively, because the costs of not doing that are too great.
John Osborne, thank you very much for your time.
Good to be with you.
Well, that's the thoughts of John Osborne from the Chamber of Commerce. But in the meantime, state premiers are continuing to stake out their positions. Victorian Premier Daniel Andrews has given some more detail about his idea to increase the Medicare levy to raise more money for health services. He's told 3AW the levy could increase from 2 to 3%, and he's received some support from Queensland.
There's obviously all sorts of options. You can make very small increases. If you were to increase it by a full percentage point, that raises the best part of $7.5 billion each and every year.
Out of taxpayers' pockets?
Indeed. Well, that's right.
So you put it up to 3%?
No, that'll go from 1.5. There is a 0.5 for the NDIS, so it would go effectively from 2 to 3. That's about $1,000 for a year for a family earning about $100,000 a year. Now, I know that is a significant hit. Maybe that's more than the community would be prepared to pay. Maybe we won't be able to find that much money. Maybe it's half that amount. I'll tell you what, 3.5 or 7.5 or whatever the number is, those billions of dollars flowing into the health system will mean better care for patients.
Daniel Andrews has raised an issue that I'm prepared to give consideration to, and that is about an increase into the Medicare levy. Now, at the moment, I've got my departments working on some modelling, and that could be a way forward. But once again, the Commonwealth needs to explain why it cut funding across the nation in health and education.
The Prime Minister has again played down expectations of any immediate outcomes this week. He says the discussions are part of a long process.
And I want the process to ensure that Australians have better schools, better hospitals, better TAFEs, better services, and at the same time that we have lower, simpler, fairer taxes. And if we do all of that, we will have a stronger economy and we will have a better, happier and more cohesive society.
Well, moving away from tax matters, the opposition is continuing to keep the heat on the Speaker, Bronwyn Bishop, over that $5,000 helicopter flight she chartered to travel from Melbourne to Geelong. But Bill Shorten has also faced questions about his own travel spending, in particular around $1,300 spent travelling from Melbourne to Sydney.
I know that whatever I've done has been on official business consistent with what ministers of both sides do. You know, the government is desperate. They're like a sort of sideshow alley busker trying to, pull a 3-card trick and say, look over here, look over there, but don't look at what's really happening. The real test here is that Mr Abbott is incapable of controlling his Speaker Every Australian knows, the whole world just about knows, that the use of a helicopter, taxpayer funded, to go to a purely party political fundraiser, and you've got a Prime Minister who can't even control his speaker. No wonder Australians are turned off politics at the moment.
Bronwyn has my confidence. She's been a good and effective Speaker of the Parliament, just as over the course of a long career in public life, she's been a good and effective Member of Parliament, and at different times she's been a good and effective Minister. Obviously, this is a serious error of judgment. I don't want to minimise it. It's a serious error of judgment, and quite understandably, the Australian people are unhappy that a senior representative in the Parliament should think that it was all right to use a helicopter to get around when a Comcar would have been available at a fraction of the price. Now, I said yesterday that she was on probation, and what I expect of Bronwyn, indeed what I expect of all of my people, is that they will act in accordance with the rules. Their total focus will be on how do we best serve the Australian people, because that's what the people expect of us. They expect us to be absolutely focused on them. Yes, it's a challenging life, this one. It's a challenging life, this one, but we come into it because we want to serve the Australian people, and we can never be distracted from service to the Australian people. And I think the message to Bronwyn, the message to all of us is, please, no errors in the future like the sorts of errors that we've seen in the not-too-distant past.
Australian beef producers say a deal to export cattle to China could be a game changer. The Agriculture Minister, Barnaby Joyce, has signed a deal to export cattle for consumption and breeding. The government says it could see up to 1 million cattle exported, which could be worth $2 billion to Australia. It's welcome news for beef producers, coming after Indonesia recently cut live exports from Australia. It'll be a few months before the first exports take place, but the Northern Territory Cattlemen's Association says it's a win for the industry.
There's no question it will mean more jobs. We're already significantly employing increasing numbers in overseas destinations, in the supply chains and on ground in Australia. As we ramp up, hopefully production longer term, it will mean more jobs. It is a good news story. We certainly value all of our export markets, and this will add just be another market choice for Australian beef producers. And it's critical that we maintain that diversity in market options. And we're looking forward to China coming online, and potentially it will be a game changer for Australian beef producers. Like all new markets and all new relationships, there will be some time that will need to be taken to develop that, and to develop a supply chain right through into the marketplace. So we're expecting a few months to bed it down and to fully understand what's in the protocol and what requirements will be asked of Australian beef producers.
Well, finally today, from next year, shoppers will notice a new system of food labelling on supermarket shelves. The government has announced its mandatory country of origin labelling. Products will be labelled with a green and gold kangaroo logo and a chart showing the proportion of the ingredients that came from Australia. The Agriculture Minister says the new labels will make it easier for consumers to make informed choices.
In the past, it was always a case of frustration where you would pick up a can and it would say something like "Made in Australia." The overwhelming sentiment of that statement was that obviously this product is Australian. Then on greater investigation, it became quite apparent it was anything but Australian. It might have been put into a can in Australia, but that's about as far as it went. What this does is gives you a clear understanding.